Hello, I'm Patricia O'Connell. I'm here with Neil Smith, with whom I had the great pleasure of working on his new book, How Excellent Companies Avoid Dumb Things, Breaking the 8 Hidden Barriers That Plague Even the Best Businesses. Neil, CEOs, managers, executives at all levels all have a lot on their plates. They're all busy. They all have a lot to think about and worry about. If there were one takeaway that you could give them from this book, what would it be?
There's two takeaways, actually. I mean, the first one is that within every company, there is a pot of gold. And it's a pretty large pot of gold as well, based on the experience of the companies that I've worked with. And the second thing really is that the way to get it is through your own employees. The secret to getting it is actually already within the organization. So in some ways, rather than focusing in tough economic times on great new strategies to improve performance, the secret is residing within the company itself.
One usually doesn't think of excellent and dumb in the same sentence. How is it that excellent companies find themselves doing dumb things or having to avoid doing them?
Well, if you think about any company that you've worked with, Patricia, and no matter how great it is, and you ask yourself, how is it that they actually do strange things that they shouldn't be doing? I think most people will identify with that. I mean, it could be when you're checking into a hotel and the room's supposed to be ready by 4 o'clock and it's not ready until 5 o'clock.
And I don't understand why they told me it was ready.
Well, so what is it that's causing them to do that? Another hotel example, your meal will be ready in 30 minutes, your room service will be ready in 30 minutes, and an hour later you still haven't got it. Why is that happening? And that can happen at even the best companies. And the first thing to realize is that it's in 90% of the cases, it's probably not their fault. The reason that companies actually do dumb things is one of two, and it's caused by the barriers. Either it's because of the structural barriers within an organization, or it's because of the behavioral barriers that all of us possess. And it's typically a combination of those barriers that cause these things to happen. And the real fault is not with the individual or the company that did it. It's trying to figure out how you could prevent it from happening again by changing the way barriers are exposed within the organization. Classic example, one company that we worked with decided to implement a green initiative, and they sent statements to their customers. It was an investment company. So what they wanted to do was produce these statements online for any customer who wanted to receive them online. 30% of their customers chose to receive them online, which is a terrific number. 6 months later, the chief executive found that the costs weren't going down in any way. So what was happening? What was happening within the company? They had decided that it was too difficult to actually implement immediately the systems change that would be needed to put these statements online and prevent sending them out to customers. What they were still doing was producing and mailing the customers. But rather than mailing them to the customers, they changed the mail address to their own address. So they're actually mailing them to themselves. So they're still producing all of these statements.
Still producing all these statements, but instead of mailing them to the customers, they were mailing them to their own company. You make what you call a promise to the companies you work with. What does that promise entail?
The promise is on different levels, but firstly, it's identifying the barriers within a company that make these things happen and removing those barriers.
And as I recall, Neil, a promise actually is an acronym for the 8 barriers that exist in every company.
It is. I mean, in the 2 words, a promise, there are 8 letters, and they are actually the acronym for the barriers. So the promise is linked into the barriers. It's identifying and breaking those barriers, but it's more important than that. There's a bigger impact than that. The promise to the company is that you yourself will find thousands of things in your organization which you're doing that you don't want to do. And it will, by stopping doing those things, it removes complexity from the organization, it removes cost from the organization, and it actually helps your employees to have a far greater experience, and your customers as well to have a greater experience.
What surprises the CEOs and senior management of the companies you work with about the promise that you make to them?
I think really 2 things. First thing is that there are thousands of ideas within their own organization that have been left unimplemented, and that can be daunting to anyone other than an open-minded manager. And I think the second thing is just the impact of all of those ideas when you add them up. I think together they cause tremendous excitement within an organization when that energy is liberated, when the barriers are broken down.
Let's talk a little bit about how they find that out. I know you used to do a more traditional form of consulting where you went into companies, you observed them, you made a lot of recommendations about things that ought to be done differently, and then you would leave them books full of these ideas and suggestions, never knowing if they would be implemented or not. What made you realize that a different approach was needed? Was it a gradual realization, or was there an aha moment when you said, there's got to be a better way to do this?
Well, I think, in that situation that you describe, I've worked for a phenomenal consulting company. I mean, one of the best consulting companies in the world. And we actually produced some superb solutions to the issues that they had. And then we'd put them in a book and we'd present those recommendations. And, in one case, 10 years later, that book was still actually sitting on a shelf above the chief executive's desk. The problem was that these great recommendations weren't being implemented. So why weren't they being implemented? They weren't being implemented because there was no step described to make them implemented, and they weren't internalized by the people who needed to implement them. So what changed? The process that I employ actually has a series of actions that people can take, thousands of actions that are as a result of all of these ideas being generated in the company, and each one of them has an action plan. So it's all about implementation.
But let's talk about the idea generation. Where are these thousands of ideas coming from in your process?
These ideas exist naturally in the organization. Now, it's not just ideas that come from the employees themselves. I and my colleagues have seen sufficient examples of great ideas in organizations to be able to supplement them and to be able to guide the thinking about these ideas.
I seem to recall when we were working on the book that you said 80% of the impact that a company realizes comes from the suggestion made by the top 20% of the organization, the senior management. If that's the case, what is the rationale for involving the entire organization in the process of coming up with ideas for change?
I think there's probably three reasons for that. I mean, the first one is that just by involving everybody in the organization, you begin to get cultural change. And cultural change means that you don't have latent ideas existing going forward. This hidden gold is taken out of the organization once and for all. You don't have it reappearing. I think the second reason is that, even in that 20%, there are some very good ideas. And very often those are ideas that are, even though they're not measured strong financially, are very good at benefiting the customer or benefiting the way that people work together. And I think the third reason is just inclusivity. You don't want this to be an exclusive exercise to the top 20% of the organization. You want it to really include everybody who's got an idea. And so those are probably the three reasons why it's worthwhile including everybody in the company in doing an exercise like this.
Can you think of an example, Neil, of an idea that was a really great idea, maybe a game changer for the company, that did not come from the top 20% of the organization, that came from somewhere lower down?
There are so many of them. In fact, there are some extraordinarily good ideas that don't come from the top. One was a medical services company, and they actually employ nurses throughout the United States who go to your home to take your blood to test for the HIV virus if you want a life insurance policy. Unfortunately, that's a test that has to be done in order to get a life insurance policy. And this company was doing probably about 2 million of those tests a year for a whole variety of insurance companies. Each of those cost about $5, $4.95 to do. So they're spending $10 million a year on HIV virus testing. One guy in their lab had a brilliant idea. He said, what if we combine blood samples into batches of 20? And let's test that batch of 20. If it's negative, we know that they're all negative. And on the rare occasion that we have a positive, we need to go back and test to figure out which one of the 20 it was. But that simple idea actually reduced the number of tests they did by about 85%, and consequently reduced the cost of testing by over $8 million a year. The sad part of that story was that guy had had that idea for 7 years and it hadn't been exposed. So if you think about the opportunity the company was missing, it was huge.
Well, that's, I think, when you were talking before about the hidden gold, that there's hidden gold in the company in the guise of all these great ideas that people have for change that don't get a chance to come to surface or to get a proper hearing.
Absolutely.
One of the 12 principles that governs your process for change is nothing less than 100% implementation is acceptable. How do you guarantee 100% implementation?
Well, in fact, it's actually more than 100%. How do you get more than 100%?
But you're only guaranteeing 100%, which is still pretty extreme.
You actually get more than 100% by aiming low and shooting high. People are very conservative in the estimates of the impact that an idea is going to generate. However, how do you even get to 100%? I mean, I think the reason for that statement is that you really wouldn't do this if you're putting ideas on the table that you're not going to implement. So there's an expectation to implement them, first of all. But secondly, every one of those ideas has an action plan before it's actually adopted into the strategic plan to make sure that it can be implemented.
And a cost value attached to it, or rather a savings value.
A savings value, or it could be a revenue idea. It could be a revenue idea as well. So it either has a savings value attached to it or an idea for improving revenue. And the whole goal of the process is to make sure that every single one of those ideas which are identified is implemented, and 100% of the impact of those ideas is actually generated from the change process. And to date, fortunately, we've not failed to achieve that.
Very, very impressive. I think one of my favorite stories was about the call center. Tell us about the call center, Neil.
Well, the call center, I mean, this was at a financial institution, and they had 24/7 call centers. And 24/7 call centers were the culture in every financial institution.
The norm across the industry. Everyone had a call center you could call anytime, day or night, to say, I don't understand this on my credit card.
Absolutely. What the call center manager wanted to do was actually reduce the call center to 20 hours, to 2 10-hour shifts. That would actually save him a lot of money. And he justified it by saying, well, you know, we're only losing 4 hours of call center time. What's the big deal? And the head of banking, the head of customers in banking, didn't want to do that because none of his competitors were actually doing it. So the way they persuaded that person to change his mind was by having him sit through the night and listen to the number of calls and the sort of calls that were actually coming in between the hours of 1 and 5. And it was pretty clear to see that the sort of calls that were coming in were not particularly high-value calls. In fact, it was almost a goodwill service to provide company to lonely people throughout the night who were checking on their balances. The whole point was there's not a lot of value on the calls that came in between 1 and 5 in the morning, and by the executive coming in to listen to those calls, he quickly realized it, and that helped him to change his mind, change his behavior, and change the culture within the organization.
Well, it also sets an example, doesn't it, when somebody at that level is willing to make a change, willing to explore a new way of doing things, willing to say, guess what? I am ready to change my mind. I wasn't right.
That's correct. That's absolutely right.
That's a great takeaway for companies, Neil, to know that the solutions lie within themselves and their own employees. Thanks for that last great bit of advice.
And thank you.
We had a lot of fun writing this book, and we hope you have as much fun reading it. Thanks very much for joining us.